Hi everyone, welcome to Marriage Dialogues. And I actually wanted to start with an interesting story that I recently read. Rabbi Eliyahu Goldsmith talks about this neighbor of his that owns an ice cream factory, and he comes and he tells a story of how for some reason the pressure kept building up and one of the valves burst. And there was cream all over the place. And it was kind of funny, and the workers were having fun. And then one of the workers actually happened to think of an idea. And that idea was to go up and turn off the valve and to release the pressure so that the spewing out of this cream all over the place would stop. And so when he was thinking about this story, he was actually thinking about in life, like there's so many pressures and it builds up and it builds up, and then like all of a sudden like you're spewing out words that you regret after. You're spewing out a response that like had you not had so much pressure, maybe you didn't eat that day, didn't sleep that enough, like if you had that groundedness because you had released the pressure in whatever ways, like, you know, we say that our body has a thermostat, an internal thermostat to really equalize the heat and cold so that we don't like disintegrate. Like there's a constant temperature innate in our body. So the same thing we have innate in our soul powers to create a system where we can protect ourselves from too much accumulation, from so much stress that ends up, you know, like into the cream, you know, spewing out things uncontrollably. And so I thought, especially this week's Parsha, when it talks about digging wells and the gushing waters, like, you know, of that are bursting forth from springs, like that are life-giving. So we want to use our words, like gushing, loving words, to burst out more and more of that bonding and love, rather than the example of, you know, the pressure of life that ends up causing people to spew out, you know, the opposite of that. So
good evening, good morning, wherever it is. Here it's evening. My wife and I were talking since we've reinitiated this dialogue that at the beginning we might select some questions, one or two that come in after a previous week's.
What? No questions came in.
I know. I'm just saying, if someone wants to submit questions, then we'll try to pick something that's exemplifies the greatest interest from the questioning, and if it's, you know, appropriate, then we'll answer as it were online. If not, we can always get back to you offline. So my wife wanted to bring up the Parsha, and I think that's appropriate. One of the things that we know as Hasidim of the Rebbe, that the Rebbe always used to, not, you know, regularly used to refer to living with the times. And as we learned the Rebbe week after week, day after day, we see that theme constantly, where the Rebbe turns to the Parsha and to an event that's taking place. So I was thinking about that, and I think it's also relevant to what you just mentioned regarding speech and spewing. So first of all, we all recognize that we're now in Chodesh Kislev. And Chodesh Kislev, the month that we all recognize. For Hanukkah, it's oftentimes referred to as a Hasidic Chodesh. a real Hasidic month, because we Hasidim have, at least by my count, 5 different, as it were, Yomim Tovim, festivals that we celebrate. Next week we can go into the other 4, but I want to focus on the one that we just experienced, which is Rosh Chodesh Kislev. And most of us will probably know that Rosh Chodesh Kislev is a Yom Tov for Hasidim, because this was the first occasion that the Rebbe made a public appearance following his massive heart attack that occurred on Shmini Atzeres in 5738, which would be 1977. And he had been receiving treatment in 770 because he did not want to go to the hospital. He wanted to be in 770, in the Kedusha of 770, Beis HaMikdash, Ma'at, the small Beis HaMikdash that the Frierdiker Rebbe established. And he wanted to be near his Hasidim. So I found a short rendition of what the Rebbe said publicly after the Yom Tov. He was able to broadcast on the radio afterward, and I'm just going to read it. I'll read the English translation from the Yiddish, and it says, "For a certain reason, we speak after the festival's conclusion, which allows us to use media to communicate what we say even in faraway places, physically far, but obviously spiritually close, which is the main thing among Jews, being that their soul is primary and their body secondary. Thereby there is formed a tie, a bond, a unity among all those who hear this speech." So this is relevant, I think, for us in the dialogue of marriage. It's also relevant for us as Yidden with what's taking place in Eretz Yisrael today. Let's first talk about it in the context of marriage. So as my wife pointed out, speech and how we treat speech with our loved ones is important. But here we see the Rebbe saying that being able to reach out and speak in a way of unity, in a way of hiskashrus, of connection to another who might be physically far, but we're spiritually close, not just by the fact that we have great love and appreciation and thoughts for our loved ones, our wife or our husband, our children, but because there is a unique spiritual bond between and amongst us that connects us. And when we use speech, even through machinery, even through this communication of radio, through sound waves, that in and of itself helps solidify and concretize that connection. So right now I can say that notwithstanding literally the centimeters that might separate my wife and I, we're still physically far. There's always a physical distance between a husband and a wife, parents and children, but a husband and a wife. And that's true, not the least of which because one is a male and one is a female. And that in and of itself creates a gashmidik difference. Doesn't matter whether the flesh is touching. There's always going to be a pa'ar, a gap between the way I see things as the husband and the way my wife sees things as the wife, the mother. And that's inevitable. And it's also extremely positive because it allows the relationship, even when you're physically close, as in proximity, or physically far, it allows for the spiritual connection to be the primary connection. As the Rebbe said, there's body and there's soul, and it's the soulful connection that is the most important. So as we go through our daily affairs and our daily lives, and we have all these differences, we have physical differences, we have different perspectives, all the things that essentially relate to gashmias, physicality, we have to keep in mind that it's that spiritual connection that brings us together as Jews, as Yidden, the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul, in which we all participate at the essential level in exactly the same way, but also the fact that we're two souls of making one, right? The whole concept of Beshert, the whole concept of Ish and Isha, that it's two things that have become solidified as one. But where they become one, they become one at the soulful level, at the level of ruchnias, not at the physical level. Because at the physical level, I'm looking into the camera and I see the vision of my wife and myself, and I can tell you there's a big difference. And
elaborate? No, just kidding.
so
You have a beard?
yeah, that was one reason.
Okay.
So I think that if we understand what the Rebbe was saying, Motzi Rosh Chodesh, Kislev, all those years back, that we recognize that also affects us. And again, it connects to what's going on in Israel as well. Because no matter how far apart we are physically, no matter how distant we are politically, right? The Yidden are coming together from all walks of life. I heard a wonderful story from a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, in which his son was out doing the tzoyim, going out to places in LA and putting on tefillin on Jews who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity. And he was saying that, you know, on a normal Friday afternoon when they do these mitzvahim, he'd get 15, 20 people to put on tefillin. But last Erev Shabbos, it was double that, or at least 50% more than the normal number. And he actually came upon someone and he asked him, "Are you Jewish? Would you like to put on tefillin?" He said, "I'm Jewish, but no." And he said, "Would you like to put on tefillin for the Jews in Israel?" And he said, "No, I support Palestine." And so this young bacher said, "Would you like to put on tefillin for the Palestinians then?" And this Jew readily agreed. That very sophisticated, mature response by a bacher to say to this Jew who obviously in the Jew's mind had turned his back on the Yidden in Israel and had somehow embraced the enemies of the Jewish people, didn't respond to that, as my wife pointed out, spewing back to him, as I might have. In fact, I made comment that I probably would have. But his response was a more Hasidic response, a far more mature response, this young man who, still in his adolescent years, by understanding that if I can tap into the soulful connection, this Yid might be thinking he's putting on tefillin for the benefit of the enemies of the Jewish people, but the Eibishter handles that part of it. The impact of putting on tefillin is holy. Even if this Jew has a bad intent, it still has an impact. And the Eibishter can take that intent and turn it into a positive thing. It can impact upon the Palestinians in a proper way, which would be through Gezer and Din. and at the same time help the Yidden. So I think this idea of always connecting to our fellow Yidden, and especially to our wives and our children, our loved ones, in this mature way of this young bacher, is the approach that leads us to have a deeper connection, both spiritually and physically.
Yes, I mean, there's a challenge though sometimes, even as we try to use our speech so beautifully, but the other person is not listening, they are not receptive, they have their imaginations of that takes them to places that causes a disconnect, even though it's not so pleasant to be at the receiving end of someone not really there hearing you. And, so one of the explanations that happens is that people will hear you when it's really coming from a very good place of unity, bonding, and love. Because let's say you're using your speech to make the other person aware that what they're doing is bothering you. But forever I've been saying this, I once was heard this rabbi say, these are the 3 rules to criticizing. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, because they don't work. It doesn't work. It's very hard for people to receive criticism. And so they're not going to hear you that what they're doing is bothering you. There actually can be, those words can be used as a stumbling block before that person to cause them to distance themselves a little more, or even retaliate in an unkind response as you're being vulnerable and sharing an emotion and sharing your pain. And it's hard for, let's say, one person to do that, and then the other person not only doesn't respond in kind for the acknowledgement of the emotion they're experiencing, and could be the opposite. So one of the explanations is that words can actually cause the circuits of the brain to frazzle. So a criticism or hearing all the news in the world actually causes a disruption in your brain. It actually causes a decrease in cognitive functioning. It has an effect on the amygdala part of the brain, which is in control of stress. So your stress hormone of cortisol goes up. And whereas a person is trying to share that what has happened hurts them, they don't realize that the partner that's hearing it is shutting down because of all these physiological factors, besides the fact if someone has low self-esteem, especially, it is even more traumatizing to be criticized. If someone has really a lot of challenge of loving oneself, so that impacts the communication. And then the spiral effect of distance can happen. When Hashem was creating the world, and he held back and held back his light and his energy, and made sure the recipient was capable of receiving his light and energy. And that's why we do Torah and mitzvahs, because then that enables us to absorb God's Kedusha and His holiness. So when we're creating a moment in time that will benefit our relationship, we have to stop and think and realize, how much am I spewing out that is just overbearing and too much for the other to receive, that will cause a stumbling block for them to fall even further away from you. So we have to follow God's lead. We have to pay attention. Are they capable right now? Maybe right. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep. They're beyond stress because they're not making ends meet this month. And we have to take all that into consideration. That's why there's a pasuk in the Torah that says, actually in Tehillim, in silence righteousness do speak. You have to be silent. You have to put on those binoculars and really scout out the situation of where they're holding. Are they able and capable of receiving your words? So that if not, then you're going to continue being a little silent, and you'll hold back, and you'll restrain. Maybe an hour, maybe a day, maybe 2 days. And then, once you figured all the dynamics of the situation out, then you'll have more power to speak righteously. Another reason for stopping is because sometimes emotions are flaring, and then when emotions are flaring, you're not going to speak in a righteous way. You've been hurt. Your heart is pounding. Your head is under so much pressure from the words they may have caused pain in you. So the pausing and grounding yourself helps you then speak more righteously, because it might not be the time to speak. Just like God stopped speaking to create the peaceful Shabbos, we have to train ourselves to follow God's lead and stop speaking for the sake of peace.
So there's actually an example of this, very good advice in the Parsha, right? So we say, as the Rebbe teaches, we have to live with the times. So in addition to Rosh Chodesh Kislev, obviously this week's Parsha is Toldos. And in Toldos, it begins, of course the pasuk begins, Ve'ehu Toidos, Yitzhak ben Avram, Avram Hoides Yitzhak. And these are the generations of Yitzhak, the son of Avram. Avram gives birth to Yitzhak. So the obvious question is, why this double mention of Avram's son is Yitzhak, and Avram gives birth to Yitzhak? It's obvious, the first mention. And it was obvious before. And so one of the explanations that Rashi, the great biblical commentator, both on the Torah, Chumash, but also on the Talmud, brings down this explanation in which he says that the late SANE Hador, the
Clowns?
The clowns, but the rabble rousers, the
Foolish?
Foolish. There's all kinds of different explanation, but it's just a non-serious person. So these non-serious people, these late SANE Hador of the generation, when Yitzhak was born, would run around amongst themselves, and whoever would listen and say, you think Yitzhak is the son of Avram? How many years? How many years did they not have children? My goodness, they claimed that Sarah gave birth to Yitzhak as a result of Avram. Avram was 99. And remember the story when Sarah got kidnapped, as it were, by Pharaoh. And she actually, she was saved only by disease, as it were, a divine disease that prevented Pharaoh from doing anything. We don't necessarily believe that. So there was all this insinuation and innuendo that Yitzhak was not the son of Avram. Now, Rashi says the late SANE Hador. So this isn't like a one-time speech. From the time that Yitzhak was born, indeed probably from the time that Sarah was pregnant, these people were going on and on and on. And nowhere do we see that Avram responded in kind. Avram didn't respond to these people. He ignored it. He kept his peace. And then one would ask, so what did the Eibishter do? Avram had this intense, intimate relationship with God that only Avram had had until that point in time. No one else comes close. He gets a special blessing from the Eibishter, a special bracha. No one else is going to get. He becomes the first Jew. Everything else comes after that, as we were told that Avram received a bracha b'kol in everything. All the particular brachas that we receive come from that first bracha that the Eibishter gave to Avram. So what did the Eibishter do? What did God do in response to these late Sanim who were insulting Avram? And by the way, insulting the son who was going to carry on the covenant, who was going to become this nation of Jews. It says, Rashi says, that the Eibishter created Yitzhak such that he had a cluster panav, that his face features resembled exactly that of Avram, so that by the time Yitzhak was grown into a young man, or a man in this case, he looked exactly like Avraham. So what do we see from the Eibishter? The Eibishter could have done many things. The Eibishter could have reached out and punished these late Sanim. The Eibishter could have shut them up. The Eibishter could have rendered them absolutely mute, so they couldn't even speak. But what happens instead? The positive response of creating something affirmative. That Yitzhak literally had the face of Avram. That this action, not speech, this act of a positive nature had the impact of negating all of the late Sanim, all of that speech. So when you feel like spewing, for whatever reason, and if you do as my wife suggests, and I can tell you she lives that, me not so, but if you do that, and instead of spewing, do something positive, right? You don't always have to speak. Do some act, some creative act of positive nature that's going to impact that other individual. And I dare say, as my wife points out, that that positive action is going to speak louder than any number of words that you're going to speak, and will have an impact such that it will open up the channels to have a positive conversation about whatever it was that bothered you later.
Right. You know, the Rambam actually talks about that. He says when people are just so insecure, they feel like they need the force of words to win the persuasion of, like almost like through the coercion of the power of the, you know, the level of loudness of, you know, and force. But the humble person, the person who is aware of Hashem and is capable of knowing that the wise things that he's saying will penetrate the other rather than the force or the loudness or the angriness about what it could be attached to those words. You know, they say what you mean, but not meanly, and but better yet, mean what you say, because sometimes people mean something, but their words don't match the real intent. The facial structure of the eyes and the way it could appear and the tone can mismatch the level of real intent that the person is trying to convey to the other person. And I find it as a therapist, so often I'm trying to like help both understand like a sentence that was said that was so blown out of proportion because of the surrounding, you know, elements that affect the speech. So we know that, you know, when we speak, we can draw actually the holy land of Eretz Yisrael around us. We know that we can draw forth Gan Eden around us through our speech. And we know that in that atmosphere that's surrounding us, it affects us on all levels. So I always say, like, you know, if it's not going to be a positive word right now, be very careful on how you're going to bring that message to the other person. And I always say to people, we all have to go on a kosher language diet. So many people dieting all over the world. So many people trying to get fit and in shape. But we have to be also careful to say less, because it's really saying a lot more.
You know, and since we're on the subject of Yitzhak, of course, everyone knows the story that the twins, Yitzhak and Esav, that, I said Yitzhak and Esav, I meant Yaakov and Esav, that Yitzhak favored Esav as this strong, hunting, kind of brutish young man. So when you go back through the Parsha and you look at the relationships and look at the Midrashim on this relationship, what you don't find is Yitzhak running to his father. I keep saying Yitzhak. Yaakov running to his father and trying to say, you've got it all wrong. I'm the spiritual one. I'm the Tiferes. Avraham was Chesed, you're Gevurah, and I'm the perfect blend. I'm Tiferes. I'm going to be the father of the 12 tribes. Nowhere do you see him denigrating Esav. His mother's instruction, we find he actually, as it were, dresses up as Esav. He, as it were, embodies Esav in order to get the blessing from his father. But the point being is that never once in that entire relationship, while Yaakov was still in his father's home, do we see that he denigrates or uses speech to hurt his brother. You know, the saying that we I don't know if it's an international saying, but I remember hearing it growing up. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Well, we were often told that so that we would not be defensive, so that we would not be hurt when someone made fun of us. And in that way, I guess it's positive, but in Yiddishkeit, that is absolutely not true. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can definitely hurt you.
More.
And more importantly, they can hurt the other, right? So if you want to say that words can't hurt me and you want to be thick-skinned and tough and say, it's meaningless. You people are just the leitzanei hador. You're just the non-serious folks who say nasty things about people because you have nothing else to do with your lives. But when it comes to your speech, it is exactly not true. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can hurt you, as Malai pointed out, even more, because they can cut to your very soul, as it were, at least to your nefesh behemis, your animal soul. They can't affect your divine soul, because that just doesn't get hurt in this way. But what do we experience on a daily basis? We experience our nefesh behemis, and the animal soul within us, which has its own intellectual capacities, its own emotional capacities, etc. And that can in fact be hurt. Ad kedei kach in Chassidus, as we know, we're taught in Tanya that the Eibishter created the world through words. And words have the capacity to literally act as a kli, as a vessel for holiness, or lahefechzeh, or the opposite of holiness. And that's why when we speak, we're very careful to use positive language and not to use negative words. Anyway,
Great book on that is Positivity Bias. It's such a good book.
Right.
I can't stop reading that.
Worth buying and reading daily.
Yeah, amazing. The Rabbi on how to speak positively and so many stories of how he judged everyone positively and wow, yeah.
And since my wife mentioned dieting and so forth, I'll draw on something that I often draw on, properly so or not so, is I'm love to compete in triathlon events. And so I do hardcore long distance training, whether it's swimming, biking, or running. And one of the things that we learn when we're training and exercising at that level is that what you think affects your performance, how you perceive the difficulty or the pain or whatever it is that is involved in that moment, and just as importantly, what you say to yourself, even to the point that my coach is always saying, when you're racing or you're training hard and everything is hurting, I want to see a smile on your face. I want to see positivity, because that's going to do two things. One, the positivity just in your face, around your mouth, is going to have an impact on your performance. You're going to do better than if you're squinting and struggling and groaning, which is what I often do. And he said, what's the other thing that's going to happen? Your smile is going to impact everyone else around you. Now, when you're racing, of course, he jokes and says, when you're smiling and you come across your competitor who's right there with you, he's going to say to himself, golly, this guy, it's not even hurting. Look at him, he's smiling. I don't have a chance, and he's going to give up. But we'd like to think in life that it's going to have a positive impact. Someone says, if he can smile or she can smile at this time, in these moments, then clearly that gives me the leverage to elevate my emotional state and smile and feel that from within. And that has an infectious impact.
And you also get happy chemicals when you fake smile. So how do we be like Adam and Chava? Adam coming from the word Aleph first, Dam from the word Domem, to be silent. And Chava actually represents, from the Hebrew word, lechavot, is to express. So we know that women got 9 parts of speech and men only got 1, and that's why they don't like to talk so much, and us women like to go on and share. Well, we notice that Hashem explains to us that even though women have been given a lot more of the power of speech, men, listen up. You're here to listen, even though it's hard for you because you're not into it. Like in all relationships, each one has to do the thing that they're not so comfortable with. So women have to work on speaking less. Men have to learn to speak a little more, and listen. And, just like Rabbi Ginsburg actually brings this up, that we all have to circumcise our words, because the word Brit Milah is Brit, and Milah is the word. So how do you do that? Well, especially if you're an air element person and a woman, if you've been gifted, with this extra koach, well, we then have to realize that extra koach, we need to channel it in a good way. So people have to speak more in their prayers. They have to speak more when they're learning Torah. They have to speak more in this spiritual endeavor, so that the Yetzer Hara cannot access that air element in you and use it in a destructive way. I remember Rabbi Deitch actually many years ago, maybe it was 26 years ago.
Rabbi Chaim Shalom Deitch.
And he was at a bris, and we were there, and he gave a Devar Torah that, I remember just oh my gosh, we all have a koach to fight, he said. We have a koach to fight. It's innate to fight the Yetzer Hara. And if we're not doing the work, the daily spiritual practices, to do what we can to weaken the power of the Yetzer Hara, then that koach of fighting will be used to fight with other people. And how many people calling daily, 8 hours a day counseling, hearing everyone is fighting. Everyone is fighting. The valve and the pressure is too much. And people are bursting. Well, the first thing I suggest is, I guess you're not fighting with your Yetzer Hara as much as maybe you could be. Maybe check it out. I ask them, are you davening every day? Are you learning Torah every day right after you're davening? Are you begging Hashem to help you fight the Yetzer Hara? Because if you don't acknowledge that you're lacking in the spiritual practices to fight your Yetzer Hara, then that's the first step. That's the first step, to acknowledge that you need God's help through His spiritual practices that He prescribed to you like a remedy to help use your fighting energy for Hashem's sake in getting rid of this Yetzer Hara.
Okay, so I'm going to take it spin it a slightly different way, a slight nuance to that. And what I think is a closer to a Hasidic explanation versus a Mussardic explanation. So when my wife says fighting the Yetzer Hara, quoting from Harav Chaim Shalom Sheyechidayich, I think a better or a different way to articulate that is to say engage in positive behavior. I don't like to think about fighting my Yetzer Hara, because if I get into the mood of fighting anything, then I just get, because of my nature, aggressive with myself, aggressive with other people, aggressive. You know, that's why I'm a trial lawyer. I like to compete. Learning, you mentioned learning Torah,
right.
davening.
The Tanya actually explains in detail that you need to use Gevurah to fight the Gevurah. There's a remedy, it's from Kabbalah, that it actually empowers and gives the source that if you use something like a snake poisonous remedy for someone who just got a snake bite, you use something of the same source to cancel out the poison, right? That's the example that Tanya gives.
Right.
And he talks about, the Alter Rebbe talks about the rage almost, that you have to say, I hate when my Yetzer Hara tricks me. I can't stand. You need to use that force to melt away, because you're using it in a good and holy way so that you won't end up fighting.
So, and
this is the
right,
remedy.
Right. So this is an interesting part of this dialogue, that my wife is advocating Gevurah to fight Gevurah. And
one remedy, there's many,
right,
but I'm not saying that.
I get it, but I'm advocating chesed in the sense that the Rebbe takes these concepts and always spins them in a positive way. I don't, and maybe someone can correct me, but I don't remember anywhere where the Rebbe, maybe in Enigris, but not in a public discourse, where the Rebbe talks about, as it were, fighting or Gevurah things, as opposed to, and I'm thinking now in my own mind's eye that I can remember some sichas, and especially in the early years of the Nesius, where the Rebbe did, but I think the majority of it is find positive outlets for your Gevurah. So you can still use Gevurah.
Sure. Fire and davening.
But it's in the concept of, overcoming some difficult sugya in the Gemara, or learning some pilpul that's going to, take enormous amount of effort and strength mentally and even physically.
Right, every which way. Yeah.
Davening, right? When you're on your feet and you don't really feel like stopping and focusing and doing what you have to do to really daven with kavanah, using your Gevurah in that sense. So that I get. But I tend to want to always look at these things as a positive Chesidic thing. you can tap into Gevura, but at the end of the day, the effort is, I don't have to fight with my Yetzirah. What I need to do is embrace something positive and do as I heard Rabbi Chaim Shalom say on many Verbringens and the Samatzedek Koel and Yerushalmi, in which we'd be sitting around Verbringen and some Avraham, some young married man who was learning in the Koel would say, well, you know, what do you do when your wife is yelling at you? Or what do you do when, you know, you don't feel like learning? Or what do you do when you have some negative thing? And that's where Chaim Shalom would point to another lesson from the Alter Rebbe. So when the Yetzer Hara comes to you, don't fight him head on. Don't confront your Yetzer Hara head on. Say, well, 1 second, stop. I'll tell you what, let's do lunch. Don't call me, I'll call you. You know, go your way. I heard you. But let's have this discussion later.
Right. I mean,
and then go do something positive. And never call your Yetzer Hara. Right? You never actually have lunch with him. That attitude is kind of a jiu-jitsu move. You take the strength and the power moving at you in one direction and just slightly move it so it goes right past you. You don't have to confront it head on and engage in fisticuffs. You just dodge it. Let his movement go right past you and you move into a positive way.
The same idea that, like, you don't want to, and you can't fight darkness with a stick. You have to turn on the light. So, but this is the light of Gevura, rather than seeing it as a fight.
So I'm going to end this, and just as a discussion with the audience that we have, my view is 45 minutes is a good time period to bring over substantive content and something for my wife and I to engage one another in. And then we can also have questions that we'll answer from the week before. If everyone wants a full hour, we can talk about that. But, or if someone wants to argue for 30 minutes, I think you need at least 30 minutes for a serious discussion between husband and wife. And this is one of my efforts to engage in positive discourse with my better half.
Okay, so beautiful night for you all. Just try to keep your perspective on the power of your words, and let's bring unity and positivity. And there's so much fighting all around the world, so let's in our own homes really put out the fires and bring in the holy light of unity and togetherness. Blessings, and thank you for joining. And if you have any questions, I'm here for a couple minutes before date night. All right. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you. Yes, such a emor ma'at v'aseh harbe. Say a little and do a lot. Blessings.